Your mother is becoming a burden, Ryan. We cannot keep pretending otherwise. Those were the words that changed everything, although neither of them knew it at the time. I was sitting at the far end of the dining table when I heard them. Melissa thought I was too busy stirring my tea to pay attention. My son thought I was too old to notice. At 72, people often assume you stop hearing things. What actually happens is the opposite. You hear everything. You simply learn when to stay quiet. My name is Evelyn Parker. I am 72 years old, a widow, and until that evening, I believed I still had a place in my own family. The dining room smelled of roasted chicken and fresh rolls. Melissa had set the table beautifully. Candles flickered in the center. Soft music played from a speaker somewhere in the kitchen. To anyone looking through the window, it would have seemed like a perfect family dinner. But families rarely break apart in dramatic moments. Most of the time, they crack quietly. One small comment at a time. One dismissive glance at a time. One decision made without you at a time. I kept my eyes on my teacup. I am just being realistic, Melissa continued. The house is too much for her. The maintenance, the expenses, everything. Ryan did not answer immediately. That hurt more than if he had agreed. He simply sat there, staring at his plate. Finally, he shrugged. Maybe. Such a small word. Such a painful one. I remembered the little boy who used to reach for my hand every time we crossed a street. The teenager who asked my advice about everything. The young man who cried when his father passed away 3 years earlier. Somewhere along the way, that son had become a man who answered his wife with a quiet maybe when she called his mother a burden. I took a slow sip of tea. Nobody noticed. Nobody asked what I thought. The conversation continued as if I were not sitting 6 feet away. Melissa began talking about simplifying life, about downsizing, about retirement communities she had read about online. She spoke gently, almost kindly. That was what made it worse. People often imagine disrespect arriving with raised voices. In reality, it frequently arrives wrapped in concern. There are some wonderful places, Melissa said. Activities, social events, people her own age. Her own age. I stared at the steam rising from my cup. 3 years earlier, after my husband George died, I had spent months learning how to live alone. I paid my own bills, managed my appointments, drove myself wherever I needed to go. Yet somehow, in Melissa's version of the story, I had become someone who needed to be managed. Ryan finally looked in my direction. Mom, what do you think? The question arrived too late. They had already discussed my future without me. Still, I forced a small smile. I think the chicken is very good. Melissa laughed softly. Ryan looked relieved. They mistook my calmness for acceptance. That was their first mistake. The dinner ended shortly afterward. Plates were cleared. Leftovers were stored away. Life moved on, at least for them. Later that night, I stood alone in my bedroom looking at a photograph of George on my dresser. He was smiling the way he always did, as though he knew something everyone else had missed. I remembered a conversation we had years earlier, one I had not thought about in a very long time. If anyone ever makes you feel small, he told me once, call Richard before you make any decisions. At the time, I thought he was talking about financial planning. Standing there in the quiet darkness, I suddenly wondered if he had meant something much bigger. Early the next morning, I woke before sunrise. Old habits are difficult to break. For 48 years, George and I started every day together. He will sit at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee while I open the curtains and let the morning light into the house. Even 3 years after losing him, parts of that routine still remain. I made coffee and stood by the window watching the neighborhood slowly wake up. A delivery truck rolled down the street. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Everything looked normal. Yet something inside me had changed after dinner the night before. Once you hear how people truly see you, it becomes impossible to unhear it. Around 10 o'clock, I walked into the family room and noticed several folders spread across the coffee table. Melissa was sitting on the sofa with her laptop open. She quickly closed one of the folders when she saw me enter. Good morning, she said with a bright smile. Good morning. I updated at the paperwork. Working on something important? Just organizing a few things. Her answer arrived too quickly. Ryan walked into the room, carrying his phone. He barely looked up. Melissa has been researching some options. Options. Another word people use when they do not want to say exactly what they mean. I nodded and sat in my usual chair. Neither of them offered any details. The silence told me everything. Later that afternoon, I left the house to run errands. On my way home, I stopped at a small bookstore George and I used to visit on weekends. I wandered through the aisles longer than necessary. Sometimes people think loneliness comes from being alone. In my experience, loneliness comes from feeling invisible. When I returned home, I clicked through the garage and heard voices coming from the kitchen. They did not realize I was there. "The sooner we figure this out, the better," Melissa said. "You know she cannot stay here forever." Ryan sobbed heavily. "I know. The house is too large. The expenses make no sense. And honestly, she would probably be happier around people of her own age." There it was again. People have their own age. As though 72 automatically placed someone in a different category of humanity. I quietly stepped back and waited several moments before entering through the front hallway. By the time I reached the kitchen, both of them were smiling. The conversation had disappeared. Melissa asked whether I wanted dinner. Ryan asked about my errands. They behaved as though nothing had happened. That evening, I sat alone in my room with an old photo album resting on my lap. Page after page shows the life George and I built together. Family vacations, school graduations, holidays, birthday parties. In every picture, I see the same thing. Sacrifice, love, commitment. Not because we were perfect, because we showed up for each other. As I turned another page, a folded note slipped from between two photographs. I immediately recognized George's handwriting. It was a simple reminder he had written years ago after meeting with our longtime financial advisor, Richard Coleman. Most people would have thrown it away. George never did. The note contains only one sentence. "Richard knows where everything is." I stared at those words for a long time. Suddenly, the conversation from years earlier returned to me with unusual clarity. If anyone ever makes you feel small, call Richard before you make any decisions. At the time, I thought it was practical financial advice. Now I was beginning to suspect George had been preparing me for something else entirely. I reached for my phone, found Richard's number in my contacts, and rested my finger above the call button. Then I hesitated. Once I made that call, I had a feeling certain truths would begin coming to light. And some truths change families forever. The next morning, I made the call. Richard Coleman answered on the third ring. His voice sounded exactly the way I remembered it. Steady, calm, the kind of voice that never rushes to conclusions. "Evelyn," he said warmly, "it has been too long." We exchanged a few pleasantries before a brief silence settled between us. Somehow, he seemed to know there was a reason I had called. "How are you really doing?" he asked. I looked out the kitchen window toward the backyard George had spent years caring for. The maple tree he planted was beginning to change color. "I am not entirely sure," I admitted. Richard did not interrupt. He simply listened. So I told him about the comments. The conversation that stopped when I entered a room. The discussions about retirement communities. The growing feeling that decisions were being made around me instead of with me. When I finished, there was another pause. "George worried this day might come," Richard said quietly. My heart tightened. "What do you mean?" "I think it would be better if we discussed that in person." We arranged to meet the following week at his office. After I ended the call, I felt strangely unsettled. Not frightened. Not exactly. More like standing at the edge of a doorway, knowing that once you step through it, there is no going back. Over the next several days, the atmosphere inside the house continued to shift. Melissa became unusually cheerful whenever she spoke about the future. She mentioned simplifying things, reducing stress, creating a better living situation for everyone. Ryan remained mostly silent. Sometimes I caught him looking at me with an expression I could not quite understand. Guilt, perhaps, or uncertainty. One afternoon, I came home earlier than expected after a doctor's appointment. As I entered through the front door, I heard voices coming from the dining room. Melissa was speaking to someone on speakerphone. I only recognized part of the conversation. "Yes, proximity to family is important," she said. "And we would like somewhere with activities and medical support available." My footsteps must have alerted her. The conversation ended suddenly. When I entered the room, Melissa smiled brightly. "How was your appointment?" she asked. I smiled back. Uneventful. Neither of us mentioned the phone call. That evening, I found myself sitting on the back porch watching the sunset. George and I had spent millions of evenings there. We used to talk about everything. Family, retirement, travel plans, the future. One memory surfaced more clearly than the others. About 6 months before he passed away, George returned home after meeting with Richard. He seemed thoughtful that evening. Not worried. Just reflective. I remember asking if something was wrong. He smiled and shook his head. "No," he said. "I am just making sure you will always be protected." At the time, I assumed he had insurance policies and legal paperwork. Now I wondered whether he had seen signs I completely missed. The following Tuesday finally arrived. Richard's office was located in a quiet brick building downtown. As I walked through the front doors, memories came rushing back. George and I had visited several times over the years. The receptionist greeted me kindly and escorted me to a conference room overlooking the city. A few minutes later, Richard entered carrying a thick leather folder. We exchanged a warm greeting before he took a seat across from me. The folder remained closed between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Richard folded his hands and looked directly at me. "Before we discussed anything else," he said, "there is something George asked me to do if you ever came here under circumstances like these." Richard slowly opened the folder. Inside were documents, notes, and a sealed envelope with George's handwriting across the front. I stared at the envelope for several seconds before touching it. George's handwriting was unmistakable, neat, careful, deliberate. The same handwriting that had filled birthday cards, grocery lists, and little notes he used to leave beside the coffee maker. Seeing it again after 3 years felt strangely emotional. Richard waited patiently. He understood that some moments should never be rushed. Finally, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The first few lines were exactly what I expected. George told me he loved me. He thanked me for the life we built together. He wrote about family memories, holidays, and ordinary moments that had mattered more than either of us realized at the time. Then the tone changed. Not drastic, just enough to make me sit a little straighter. George wrote that people often reveal their true intentions when they believe someone has become dependent on them. He explained that aging does not diminish a person's value, but it often changes how others perceive that value. As I continued reading, I felt an uncomfortable sense of recognition. George had seen something years ago that I had chosen to ignore. He had noticed subtle shifts in behavior, casual comments, conversations about money, questions that seem innocent on the surface but carry a different meaning underneath. When I finished the letter, I carefully folded it and placed it back on the table. Richard remained silent for a moment. Then he opened the folder further and removed several documents. "George asked me to review these with you if this conversation ever became necessary." I adjusted my glasses and looked down at the papers. At first, they appeared to be ordinary financial statements, investment accounts, trust documents, property records. Yet the deeper we went, the more surprised I became. George had spent years organizing our financial affairs with remarkable precision. Every account, every investment, every property interests, everything has been documented. Everything was protected. Most importantly, everything had been structured in a way that ensures I remain fully in control. Richard slides one document across the table. "Do you recognize this?" I looked closely. It was the trust agreement George established several years before his passing. I remember signing paperwork, but at the time I paid little attention to the details. George handled most of those meetings. "You are the sole trustee," Richard explained. "You retain full authority over every major financial decision connected to these assets." I blinked several times. "I do." Richard nodded. "Yes." The realization settled slowly. Over the past few months, I had begun to feel like someone whose future was being managed by other people. Yet according to the documents in front of me, I remain the primary decision maker. Nobody can move assets. Nobody can sell property. Nobody could restructure investments without my approval. Richard continued, "There is something else you should know." He opened another section of the folder. Inside were summaries of accounts I had not reviewed in years. I stared at the numbers. They were significantly larger than I expected. George had been more successful with long-term planning than I ever realized. Years of disciplined investing had quietly accumulated into substantial financial security. I looked up at Richard. Why did George never tell me all of this? A small smile crossed his face. Because he believed you never measured life by money. That sounded exactly like George. He had always valued peace of mind more than displays of wealth. Richard leaned back slightly. "Evelyn, I am not telling you this so you feel powerful. I am telling you because facts matter, especially when other people begin making plans based on assumptions." The word assumption stayed with me. Melissa assumed I was dependent. Melissa assumed I needed guidance. Melissa assumed decisions would eventually pass to her and Ryan. But assumptions are not facts. For the first time in months, I felt something beginning to change. Not angry, not revenge, clarity. Before I left, Richard handed me a folder containing copies of the most important documents. As I stood to leave, he asked a simple question. Has anyone suggested a family meeting yet? I paused. Then I thought about the whispered conversations, the retirement, communities, the carefully worded discussions about simplifying my life. Not directly, I said. Richard nodded slowly. They will. As I walked back to my car beneath the bright afternoon sun, I had a feeling that whatever happened next, I would no longer be entering the conversation unprepared. Richard was right. The invitation arrived sooner than I expected. 3 days after our meeting, Melissa announced during breakfast that she wanted to organize a family discussion over the weekend. She said it casually while pouring orange juice, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. I think it would be good for everyone to sit down and talk about the future, she said. Future. Another one of those words that sounded harmless until you listened carefully. Ryan nodded without looking up from his phone. That makes sense. I buttered a piece of toast and remained quiet. Melissa turned towards me. What do you think, Evelyn? It was interesting. For months, conversations about my future had happened around me. Now suddenly they wanted my opinion. Not because their attitude had changed, because they were getting ready to present a plan. I think conversations are usually better than assumptions, I replied. Melissa smiled. Exactly. Her relief was noticeable. She believed the meeting would be simple. She believed she already knew how it would end. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention than ever before. Small details began revealing themselves everywhere. Melissa spent long periods on her laptop reviewing documents. Ryan took several phone calls outside where he thought nobody could hear him. One evening, I walked into the kitchen and found a brochure sitting partially hidden beneath a magazine. The cover featured smiling seniors standing in front of a beautiful building surrounded by landscaped gardens. Retirement living, independent community, resort-style amenities. I picked it up and studied it for several seconds before placing it back exactly where I found it. Nobody mentioned the brochure. Nobody needed to. By Friday evening, I understood the situation clearly. The meeting was not intended to gather opinions. It was designed to persuade me, perhaps even pressure me. What Melissa did not know was that I had stopped feeling vulnerable the moment Richard showed me the truth. Saturday arrived bright and clear. Autumn sunlight fills the house through every window. Around 4 o'clock, Melissa began preparing snacks and arranging chairs in the family room. The effort felt oddly formal, almost rehearsed. At 6 o'clock, Ryan asked if I would join them downstairs. I followed him into the family room and immediately noticed an additional chair positioned near the center of the room. Melissa sat on one side. Ryan sat beside her. The empty chair faces both of them. I almost smiled. It felt less like a family conversation and more like an intervention. Thank you for doing this, Melissa said warmly. Of course, I replied. She folded her hands together. We have been thinking a lot about what is best for everyone moving forward. There it was, the opening statement. Carefully prepared. Ryan shifted slightly in his seat. Melissa continued talking about practical concerns, maintenance costs, future planning, safety, convenience. She spoke gently and confidently. Every argument sounds reasonable when viewed separately. That was what made them effective. Then she reached the real subject. We found several wonderful communities that offer support and social opportunities. I nodded slowly. I see. Ryan finally speaks. Mom, we just want you to be happy. I looked at my son for several seconds. He truly believes that sentence. That was the tragedy of it. He no longer recognizes the difference between helping someone and managing them. Melissa opened a folder resting on the coffee table. Several brochures slide into view. Photographs, floor plans, pricing information. She had done extensive research. You do not have to decide immediately, she said. But we thought it would be good to start exploring options. I leaned back comfortably in my chair. For the first time since the conversation began, I felt completely calm. Not because I was winning, because I finally understood the entire game. Then I said something neither of them expected. That is interesting, I replied. Because I invited someone to this discussion as well. The expressions on their faces changed instantly. A few seconds later, the doorbell rang. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The documents remain on the coffee table between us like a mirror reflecting realities nobody had expected to see. Melissa stared at the pages. Ryan stared at Richard. I simply yes. Ryan's question lingered in the room long after he asked it. For months, perhaps even years, nobody had truly asked what I wanted. They had discussed possibilities. They had offered suggestions. They had built plans. But wanting to know what another person actually desires requires listening, and listening had become surprisingly rare inside our family. I looked at my son and took a slow breath before answering. I want respect, I said. Neither Ryan nor Melissa spoke. Not control. Not special treatment. Not permission to make decisions. I simply want the same respect I gave other people for most of my life. The words were calm, but they carried more weight than I expected. Ryan lowered his eyes. Melissa stared at the brochures on the table. For the first time, nobody seemed interested in defending a position. They were finally hearing something that should have been obvious from the beginning. I never thought we were disrespecting you, Ryan admitted quietly. I nodded. That is usually how these things happen. The room fell silent again. Outside, darkness had settled over the neighborhood. The reflection of the living room lamps glowed softly against the windows. Everything felt strangely peaceful. Not because the problem had been solved, but because the truth was finally sitting in the open where everyone could see it. Melissa leaned forward and folded her hands together. Her confidence from earlier in the evening was gone. I honestly believed we were helping, she said. The retirement communities looked nice. The services looked useful. I believe she meant it. At least partly. The difficulty was that good intentions often become tangled with personal convenience. Did you ever ask if I wanted to leave my home? I asked gently. Melissa opened her mouth, then stopped. The answer was obvious. She had researched buildings, compared prices, collected brochures. Yet somehow she had skipped the most important conversation. Ryan stood and walked toward the kitchen. A few moments later, he returned carrying 3 glasses of water. It reminded me of the little boy he once was. Whenever family discussions became uncomfortable, he always looked for a practical task to perform. Some habits survive adulthood. He handed me a glass and sat down again. I think Dad saw this coming, he said quietly. The statement surprised me. Not because it was untrue, but because Ryan had finally reached the conclusion on his own. I thought about George's letter, his planning, his conversations with Richard. I think he worried people might mistake kindness for dependence, I replied. Ryan nodded slowly. Melissa remains thoughtful. For the first time since the meeting began, she seemed more reflective than defensive. Then she asked a question I had not expected. Are you angry with us? I considered the answer carefully. It would have been easy to say yes. Easier still to list every hurtful moment from the past year. But the truth was more complicated. I was hurt, I said. Very hurt. But anger is different. Melissa looked relieved, though only slightly. I think both of you stopped seeing me clearly, I continued. You became so focused on what might happen someday that you forgot who I am right now. Nobody argues. They couldn't. Deep down, they knew it was true. The conversation lasted another hour. Not about finances. Not about property. Not about retirement communities. We talked about family. About George. About the years that had passed since his death. Somewhere along the way, the discussion stopped being a negotiation and became something closer to honesty. When the evening finally ended, Melissa gathered the brochures from the table. Without saying a word, she placed them back into the folder and carried them out of the room. Ryan walked me to my bedroom door. Before leaving, he hesitated. Mom. Yes. His voice was quiet. I'm sorry I stopped listening. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I smiled softly. Start listening now, and that will be enough. As I closed the bedroom door behind me, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because I had won an argument, because something far more important had happened. For the first time since George died, my family had finally begun to see me again. The weeks that followed felt different from everything I had experienced since George passed away. Not because my circumstances changed overnight. They didn't. I still live in the same house. I still follow many of the same routines. The difference was something far less visible. The atmosphere had changed. For the first time in a long while, conversations included me instead of circling around me. One Saturday morning, I walked into the kitchen and found Ryan making coffee. He looked up and smiled. Good morning, Mom. Such a simple moment. Yet there was something genuine in it that had been missing before. We sat together at the table for nearly an hour talking about ordinary things. Sports, the weather, memories of George. Not once did the conversation turn toward managing my future. It felt like we were family again instead of participants in a negotiation. Melissa changed too, although more gradually. Trust does not return everything at once. It arrives in small pieces. She stopped leaving brochures around the house. She stopped talking about retirement communities. More important solutions, she began asking questions before offering. One afternoon, she joined me on the back porch where I was reading a novel. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." She hesitated before speaking. "What do you want to do with the next few years?" The question made me smile. Not because of the answer, because of the respect behind it. We spent nearly an hour talking. Not about what she thought I should do. About what I wanted to do. Travel. Volunteer work. A few home projects George and I never finished. For the first time, she listened without trying to direct the conversation somewhere else. As autumn slowly gave way to winter, I found myself thinking often about the chain of events that brought us here. The comments at the dinner table. The hidden assumptions. The brochures. The meeting with Richard. Looking back, I realized something important. The greatest mistake my family made was not believing I was old. I am old. There is no shame in that. Their mistake was believing age automatically meant dependence. George understood the difference. Richard understood the difference. Eventually, Ryan and Melissa learned it too. A few days before Christmas, I visited Richard's office one final time that year. We reviewed several routine financial matters and discussed plans for the coming year. As our meeting ended, he smiled and asked how things were going at home. I thought carefully before answering. "Better," I said. "Not perfect, but better." Richard nodded. That is usually how real life works. As I prepared to leave, he handed me the original letter George had written. I had already read it several times, but seeing it again brought back the same feeling of gratitude. George had not left me a strategy for defeating anyone. He had left me something far more valuable. Confidence. Confidence in my judgment. Confidence in my independence. Confidence in my own voice. On Christmas Eve, the entire family gathered around the dining table. The same table where everything had started months earlier. Laughter filled the room. Candles flickered softly. Snow drifted past the windows outside. At one point, Ryan raised his glass and looked toward me. Dad always said Mom was the strongest person he knew. A quiet smile spread across my face. Melissa nodded in agreement. This time there was no hesitation. No discomfort. Just honesty. Later that evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood alone in the family room next to George's photograph. The house was silent. The Christmas tree lights reflected softly against the windows. I looked at his smiling face and thought about how close I had come to doubting myself. How close I had come to let other people decide who I was. Then I remembered something Richard said during our first meeting. Facts matter. He was right. The facts had protected my finances. But something else had protected my dignity. The simple decision to stop shrinking myself for the comfort of others. At 72, I learned a lesson I wish I had understood much earlier. The moment people stop seeing your value is not the moment you lose it. It is simply the moment they need to be reminded where it was all along.